This is Israel, a small country on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, home to roughly 9.4 million people and one of the most dynamic economies in the world. That might come as a surprise, because on paper, Israel doesn't seem to have many economic advantages. In fact, it faces an unusual number of disadvantages. For one, Israel exists in a region where most of its neighbors have historically been hostile toward it. And while we won't dive deep into the politics, from an economic standpoint, this isolation matters a lot. Most prosperous nations thrive on regional cooperation and open trade. But Israel doesn't have that luxury. It has no direct land trade routes with nearby countries, spends a large share of its budget on defense, and relies heavily on sea routes for international commerce. That works, but it limits flexibility, especially when it comes to critical imports like energy that are cheaper and easier to move by land pipelines. To make things tougher, Israel lacks major natural resources, has limited farmland, and a small labor force not nearly enough to sustain low-cost mass manufacturing. Back in 2009, over 5% of Israel's GDP went toward energy imports, a dependency that made it vulnerable to nations that weren't exactly friendly toward it. This also drained capital from the domestic economy. Money that could have gone into innovation or industry was instead spent just to keep the lights on. And yet, despite all these constraints, Israel today stands among the wealthiest and most technologically advanced nations in the world. Its per capita output rivals, and in some cases exceeds that of countries like Canada, Germany, and the UK. That's remarkable, especially considering that just 40 years ago, Israel's economy looked like those of Turkey, Lebanon, or Sri Lanka today, burdened by high inflation, weak growth, and political instability. But Israel turned it all around. So how did that happen? What fueled this economic transformation? And can other nations in crisis follow a similar path? Let's find out. The crisis of the 1980s. Israel's modern economic story begins in the mid-1980s, when the country was battling runaway inflation, over 350% a year. The Israeli shekel had lost nearly all its value, forcing citizens to trade and save in US dollars instead. That might sound like a clever workaround, but using a foreign currency strips a government of its monetary control. If people earn and spend in dollars, the state can't easily collect taxes or influence the money supply. It's a dangerous spiral. The government tried to raise taxes and print more money to cover deficits, which only fed inflation further. This is the exact same trap that countries like Turkey have fallen into more recently, where political leaders force central banks to lower interest rates, thinking it'll spur growth, when in reality it only worsens inflation. High inflation kills confidence. It makes long-term contracts, loans, and salaries impossible to manage. If your currency loses half its value in a few months, why would anyone agree to a multi-year deal? Economists generally agree that inflation above 5% starts doing more harm than good. So Israel's 370% rate was catastrophic. People simply stopped trusting their money. And restoring that trust became Israel's top priority. The 1985 Economic Stabilization Plan. In 1985, the government launched a sweeping reform program and introduced a new currency, the new Israeli shekel, NIS, to replace the worthless old one. But a new currency alone wouldn't solve anything. People had to believe that this time would be different. So, the government introduced a 5-point stabilization plan. Drastically cut public spending, trimming welfare, public jobs, and infrastructure outlays to reduce demand and inflationary pressure. Grant full independence to the Bank of Israel, ensuring that monetary policy could operate without political interference. Devalue the currency to make exports cheaper and more competitive, while temporarily fixing its exchange rate afterward to restore stability. Tighten fiscal discipline, avoiding deficits that would require printing money. Encourage savings and investment in the new shekel to rebuild public confidence. These measures were painful. Unemployment rose, and living standards dipped, but they worked. By the late 1980s, inflation was back under control, the new shekel stabilized, and most domestic transactions were once again conducted in Israel's own currency. This gave the country the foundation it needed to grow. From stability to growth, by 1987, Israel's GDP per capita was around $9,000, roughly half that of the US, at the time respectable, but not impressive. Then came the turning point, the discovery of offshore natural gas fields. For the first time, Israel became energy self-sufficient, freeing itself from dependence on imported fuel. But that wasn't what made Israel rich. The real engine of growth was innovation. Israel began investing heavily in research and development. spending more than double the share of GDP that even the US allocated to R&D. It also built world-class industries from semiconductors and cybersecurity to defense systems and diamond cutting. Tourism helped too. Israel receives around 4 million visitors a year, nearly one for every 2 citizens. Yet tourism makes up just 2% of GDP, showing how diverse and high value the rest of the economy is. The innovation nation. What truly sets Israel apart is how it nurtured its tech ecosystem. Instead of having a few massive corporations dominate, like Samsung in South Korea, Israel encouraged the growth of thousands of small, specialized tech startups. This created a resilient, diverse economy, less dependent on any single company. International firms from the US and Europe also poured in, setting up R&D centers around Tel Aviv, now famously known as Silicon Wadi, a Middle Eastern counterpart to Silicon Valley. The Israeli government played a key role here. Rather than funding companies directly, a process vulnerable to corruption, it offered zero-interest loans and tax incentives to private investors who put their own money into local startups. This hybrid model minimized corruption and created a self-sustaining innovation loop. Investors took real risks, startups gained access to capital, and the government got its loans repaid, all while building a cutting-edge industrial base at virtually no net cost. In the 1990s, another boost came when nearly 1 million skilled migrants, engineers, scientists, and doctors from the former Soviet Union moved to Israel, instantly expanding its technical talent pool. Israel today. In just a few decades, Israel transformed from an inflation-ridden state into one of the most prosperous economies in the world. Today, its GDP sits at around $488 billion, ranking 29th globally, just behind Ireland and Norway. That's a 7 out of 10 for economic size. With a GDP per capita of roughly $52,000, Israel ranks 15th worldwide, ahead of major economies like Germany, Japan, and Canada, earning it an 8 out of 10 for productivity. Stability and confidence get a 6 out of 10. Geopolitical risks remain, but investor trust has grown dramatically. Growth, meanwhile, deserves a 9 out of 10. The country has nearly doubled its output in the last decade, expanding at around 7% per year. In an industry, Israel shines again with an 8 out of 10, leading in defense, tech, semiconductors, and diamonds. That gives Israel an overall score of 7.6 out of 10, an extraordinary result for a small country surrounded by challenges, proving that smart policy, innovation, and resilience can overcome geography and politics.